12th April 1945, 3:35 p.m., 10 Downing Street, London. The secure telephone line crackled with static. Churchill's hand trembled as he replaced the receiver. Roosevelt was dead. The man who had shared Britain's darkest hours, who understood the delicate balance of power, who trusted Churchill implicitly, gone. Within hours, Truman began dismantling everything. Every advisor Roosevelt had cultivated, every diplomat who understood the fragile alliance, systematically removed. Churchill faced his greatest fear. America's new leadership had no idea what they were about to unleash upon the world. 12th April 1945, 10:47 p.m. The blackout curtains in Churchill's private study remained drawn despite VE Day approaching. Outside, London bore scars of 5 years' bombardment, entire streets reduced to rubble, St. Paul's miraculously standing among devastation. Inside, cigarette smoke hung thick as Churchill read cable after cable from Washington with mounting dread. Each message confirmed what he feared most. The careful diplomatic architecture built over 4 brutal years was being demolished with American efficiency. Roosevelt's inner circle had been extraordinary precisely because they understood something fundamental about warfare that extended beyond military victory. Hopkins, Harriman, Wynant, these men comprehended Stalin's true nature, recognized that defeating Hitler represented only half the struggle, understood that the peace would be won or lost in diplomatic negotiations happening now, before Germany's final collapse. They had spent years learning how the Soviet system operated, which promises Stalin would keep, which were merely theater. Churchill had cultivated these relationships deliberately, patiently, explaining British strategic thinking, sharing intelligence assessments, building trust through shared adversity during Britain's loneliest months. The statistical reality was stark. Britain had sustained 450,000 casualties, spent $7 billion annually, 25% of national wealth, on war effort alone. British cities had endured 127 major bombing raids. The empire was financially exhausted, dependent on American lend-lease for survival, yet strategically positioned across global choke points Stalin coveted. Roosevelt understood this asymmetry, appreciated that Britain's weakness paradoxically made her more valuable as America's eyes and ears in Europe. His advisors shared this comprehension. They recognized Churchill not as supplicant, but as experienced partner whose warnings about Soviet intentions deserved serious consideration. Truman's ascension changed everything with brutal suddenness. Within 72 hours, the new president began receiving different advisors, men who viewed European politics through idealistic American lens, who believed Stalin's promises about free elections, who saw Churchill's warnings as British imperialism seeking to manipulate American power for colonial preservation. James Burns, a South Carolina politician with virtually no foreign policy experience, was being positioned as Secretary of State. The man had never negotiated with Soviet officials, never witnessed how they operated, never experienced the chilling realization that Stalin viewed promises as tactical instruments to be discarded when inconvenient. Churchill's first telephone conversation with Truman had been cordial but disturbing. The new president lacked Roosevelt's instinctive understanding of European power dynamics, seemed almost suspicious of Churchill's advice, surrounded himself with advisors who whispered that Britain was trying to trick America into protecting her empire. Admiral Leahy remained, but his voice was increasingly drowned by newcomers who saw the world in black and white. America and Britain were righteous. Russia had suffered terribly. Therefore, Russia deserved trust and territory. The nuance, the experience, the hard-learned lessons about Soviet negotiating tactics, all dismissed as cynical, old-world thinking. The Foreign Office assessment delivered that evening quantified Churchill's nightmare. Soviet forces occupied Poland, Czechoslovakia, Romania, Bulgaria, Hungary, 100 million Europeans under Red Army control. Stalin was installing puppet governments systematically, ignoring Yalta agreements about free elections with contemptuous ease. British intelligence reported NKVD operatives arresting democratic leaders throughout Eastern Europe, show trials being prepared, opposition parties being crushed. Every day delayed the reckoning, allowed Stalin to consolidate control further, making eventual liberation exponentially more costly. Roosevelt's team would have recognized these patterns immediately, would have supported Churchill's proposals for Anglo-American forces driving deeper into Central Europe before halting, would have understood why preventing Soviet control of Vienna and Prague mattered strategically. Truman's new advisors saw only logistics. Why advance further when the war was won, when Russia was ally, when American soldiers wanted home? They accused Churchill of warmongering, of seeking to preserve British influence, of being unable to accept that America would chart her own course. Eden found Churchill past midnight, still reading intelligence reports by lamplight. The Prime Minister looked older than his 70 years, the vitality that had sustained Britain through her darkest hours visibly draining. "They're going to give Stalin everything," Churchill said quietly, ash from his cigar scattering across maps showing Soviet advance. Roosevelt understood what we were fighting for wasn't just defeating Hitler, it was preventing another tyranny from replacing it. "These new men think we're exaggerating, that Stalin will become reasonable once the war ends, that we're trying to manipulate them into fighting our battles." He gestured toward casualty reports. "We've bled for 5 years. We've survived alone when America watched. We've earned the right to be heard, and they're dismissing us as yesterday's empire playing yesterday's games." The diplomatic cables confirmed the pattern accelerating. Harriman was being recalled from Moscow. The ambassador who actually understood Soviet methods, who had warned Washington repeatedly about Stalin's true intentions. His replacement would be someone more optimistic about Soviet-American cooperation. Hopkins, Roosevelt's closest advisor and the man Stalin oddly respected, was being sidelined, his health failing, his influence evaporating. Wynant was being ignored in London, his assessments filed away unread. The institutional knowledge built through years of painful experience was being deliberately discarded because it contradicted the narrative Truman's advisors preferred, that winning the war meant everyone could go home, trust prevailing, peace secured. Churchill understood what they couldn't, without having negotiated with Stalin personally. The Soviet leader respected only strength, tested every boundary, retreated only when confronted with force. The diplomatic dance required constant vigilance, consistent pressure, unified Anglo-American front. Weakness invited aggression, division invited exploitation, naivety invited catastrophe. Roosevelt's team knew this instinctively. Truman's team would need to learn through bitter experience, and millions would suffer during their education. The clock struck 3. Outside, dawn approached over bombed London. Churchill extinguished his cigar and opened the folder marked Operation Unthinkable, the contingency plan for confronting Soviet expansion militarily if diplomacy failed. He prayed it would never be needed, but Truman's purge of experienced advisors made catastrophic miscalculation increasingly probable. The greatest danger to peace wasn't German remnants or Japanese resistance. It was American inexperience combined with Soviet ambition, creating vacuum where wisdom should guide policy. And Britain, exhausted and impoverished, could only watch as the architecture of hard-won understanding collapsed, replaced by dangerous innocence that threatened everything they'd fought to preserve. 28th April 1945, 8:15 a.m., Foreign Office, London. Spring rain hammered Georgian windows as Cadogan spread decoded intercepts across Churchill's desk. The messages painted disturbing picture. Truman's advisors were systematically reversing Roosevelt's final instructions regarding Soviet conduct. Where Roosevelt had stiffened his position after Yalta, angered by Stalin's blatant violations in Poland, Truman's team was softening language, accepting Soviet justifications, prioritizing cooperation over accountability. The gap between British assessment and American policy was widening daily, and they were running out of time to prevent catastrophic divergence. The operational reality facing Churchill was brutally constrained. Britain fielded 5 million service personnel, but national debt exceeded $3 billion. Rationing was stricter than during the Blitz. Industrial production was declining as factories awaited peacetime conversion. Every week, Lend-Lease delivered supplies worth $20 million, absolutely essential for survival. American financial support wasn't charity, but lifeline. Britain couldn't sustain military operations, couldn't feed her population, couldn't maintain empire commitments without American backing. This dependency created terrible vulnerability. Disagreeing too forcefully with Washington risked economic strangulation. Yet disagreement was essential, because Truman's team was making fundamental errors that would reshape Europe disastrously. At Potsdam preparation meetings, American negotiators proposed concessions that stunned British diplomats. Accepting Soviet annexation of eastern Poland without meaningful compensation, recognizing communist governments installed at gunpoint, withdrawing Anglo-American forces from advanced positions to occupation zones, agreed before military realities changed. Each proposal surrendered leverage, validated aggression, encouraged further expansion. British objections were noted politely and ignored consistently. The pattern reflected systematic replacement of experienced voices with ideological ones. Burns, now confirmed as Secretary of State, genuinely believed he could charm Stalin into reasonable compromise. The man had built career-making deals with Southern Democrats, assumed international diplomacy operated similarly. Everyone wanted something. Everyone could be satisfied through clever bargaining. He didn't grasp that Stalin's objectives were non-negotiable. Buffer states under absolute control, territorial expansion, ideological dominance. Compromise was weakness to be exploited, not basis for settlement. Churchill attempted education through patient explanation. He arranged briefings where British intelligence officers detailed Soviet methods, how NKVD operated, how puppet governments were installed, how free elections would be staged. He shared decrypted communications showing Stalin's private instructions to communist parties throughout Europe. He invited American officials to witness refugees flooding west, Polish Home Army fighters escaping arrest, Baltic refugees fleeing deportation, Czech Democrats recognizing Soviet occupation for what it truly was. Some Americans listened uncomfortably. Most dismissed the evidence as British propaganda designed to manipulate American policy for imperial purposes. The psychological dynamic was devastating. Truman's advisors had absorbed specific narrative during Roosevelt's final months. Britain was declining power, clinging desperately to empire. Churchill was yesterday's man fighting yesterday's wars. America must chart independent course, untainted by European cynicism. This narrative made them dismissive of British experience, suspicious of British motives, deaf to British warnings. When Churchill cautioned that Stalin wouldn't honor agreements, they heard British imperialism. When Eden explained Soviet tactics, they heard colonial manipulation. The harder Britain pushed, the more resistant Washington became. Intelligence estimates delivered mid-May quantified the disaster unfolding. Soviet forces controlled 300,000 square miles of Europe they hadn't occupied when Yalta was negotiated. Red Army divisions were being positioned permanently, not temporarily. NKVD was arresting 2,000 political opponents weekly across occupied territories. Communist parties were seizing control of interior ministries, security services, state media. The window for preventing permanent Soviet domination was closing rapidly, perhaps 6 months before control became irreversible. Every week of American hesitation cemented communist power further. Churchill proposed concrete actions. Insist on international observers for promised elections, maintain Anglo-American forces at advanced positions until Soviet compliance with Yalta terms, coordinate economic aid to prevent Soviet economic coercion, support democratic resistance movements. Each proposal was rejected as provocative, as risking cooperation, as reflecting outdated thinking. Burns was planning friendly meeting with Stalin, convinced personal rapport would solve disagreements. Truman was preparing victory speech, emphasizing alliance unity. Neither wanted Churchill's warnings complicating their narrative. The physical toll was visible. Churchill's correspondence from this period shows handwriting deteriorating, sentences trailing off, frustration bleeding through diplomatic language. He was sleeping 3 hours nightly, consuming whiskey steadily, chain-smoking through meetings. The man who had rallied Britain through darkest hours now confronted challenge perhaps more dangerous. Victory being transformed into defeat through naive mismanagement, and his warnings falling on ears determined not to hear. British military planners developed contingency responses, assuming worst case. Soviet forces remaining in Eastern Europe permanently, puppet governments consolidating control, eventual confrontation becoming inevitable. General Ismay briefed Churchill that Britain alone couldn't confront Soviet expansion militarily, required American partnership, which meant American understanding. But understanding required experience, which meant painful lessons, which meant suffering for millions trapped under Soviet occupation. The cruel mathematics allowed no alternative. Either Truman's team learned quickly through British guidance or learned slowly through catastrophic failure. Churchill was failing at the former, meaning the latter became probable. The final blow came June 1st. Hopkins, dying, exhausted, but still trusted by Stalin, flew to Moscow for final mediation attempt. His instructions came from Truman's new advisors, not from accumulated wisdom of Roosevelt's approach. Hopkins was told to be conciliatory, emphasize cooperation, avoid confrontation. The Soviets recognized weakness immediately. Stalin became more demanding, not less. Discussions that should have produced compromise instead validated Soviet position. When Hopkins returned, he confirmed what Churchill feared. The new American approach was being interpreted not as friendship, but as exploitable naivety. Churchill sat in cabinet room that evening, rain still falling outside, maps showing Soviet control spreading like ink stain across Europe. Around him, ministers who'd sustained Britain through years of solitary struggle now confronted different challenge. Their closest ally didn't trust their warnings. Their experience was dismissed as cynicism. Their strategic understanding was being ignored systematically. "We've earned the right to be believed," Churchill said quietly. "We were right about Hitler when America doubted. We were right about the bombing campaign. We were right about the Mediterranean strategy. We're right about Stalin, and we're being dismissed as alarmists protecting yesterday's empire." He looked at Eden. "They'll learn. Everyone learns eventually. The question is, how many will die during their education?" 16th July, 1945, Potsdam, Germany. The lakeside palace, chosen for summit, bore minimal bomb damage. Truman's quarters overlooked water that reflected summer sky with deceptive tranquility. Inside, the atmosphere was anything but peaceful. Churchill arrived for preliminary Anglo-American meeting with thick briefing files documenting Soviet violations since Yalta. Truman was cordial, but clearly irritated by Churchill's insistence on raising uncomfortable topics. The president wanted smooth conference projecting alliance unity. Churchill wanted confrontation, forcing Stalin to choose between honoring agreements or revealing true intentions. The fundamental disagreement threatened conference before it began. Burns exemplified American misunderstanding perfectly. The Secretary of State had brought gift for Stalin, information about successful atomic bomb test in New Mexico, delivered casually as demonstration of American trust. Churchill was horrified. Sharing such intelligence gave Stalin no reason to moderate behavior. He now knew America possessed ultimate weapon, yet was sharing secrets freely, confirming his assessment that Americans were strategically naive. Instead of increasing Soviet caution, the revelation would increase Soviet paranoia, accelerating their own nuclear program, beginning arms race that would define coming decades. The first plenary session revealed how completely Truman's team misread Stalin. American delegation opened proposing broad cooperation, United Nations Organization, international trade agreements, democratic governance throughout Europe. Stalin listened politely, smiled occasionally, then systematically rejected every proposal that limited Soviet freedom of action. When Burns suggested international observers for Polish elections, Stalin's response was curt. Poland is Soviet responsibility. Internal matters are not subject to foreign interference. When Truman mentioned Yalta provisions, Stalin's expression hardened. Agreements must reflect current realities. British delegation watched with grim vindication as Americans encountered what Churchill had tried explaining for months. Stalin wasn't negotiating in good faith, he was stating terms. Territory occupied by Red Army would remain under Soviet control. Governments installed by Moscow would remain in power. Elections would occur when Soviet authorities determined conditions were suitable, meaning when outcomes were guaranteed. The pattern was identical to what British intelligence had documented. Soviet negotiators stonewalled, deflected, demanded, never compromised on core interests. The critical moment came during discussion of German occupation zones. Anglo-American forces had advanced beyond agreed boundaries during final offensive. Eisenhower had halted at Elbe River as planned, but Patton's forces had pushed into Czechoslovakia. Montgomery's troops occupied strategic ports. Churchill proposed maintaining these advanced positions as leverage for Soviet compliance elsewhere. Simple, transactional diplomacy. Truman's advisors rejected this approach as dishonorable. Agreements must be kept, regardless of Soviet behavior. Stalin concealed his satisfaction perfectly. American officials began questioning their assumptions privately. Harriman, marginalized but present, found his earlier warnings suddenly being recalled. "You tried telling us," admitted Assistant Secretary Clayton over private dinner. "We thought you'd gone native, absorbed British cynicism." Harriman's response was tired. "Britain isn't cynical. Britain is experienced. There's a difference." But experience was being purchased at terrible cost. Every day of conference delays, Soviet control solidified further across Eastern Europe. NKVD was conducting mass arrests, show trials were beginning, opposition was being crushed. The education Truman's team was receiving came at price paid by others. Churchill proposed specific test of Soviet intentions. Britain would recognize Romanian government if genuine free elections occurred under international supervision. Simple, verifiable, reasonable. Stalin's rejection was immediate and absolute. Romania fought against Soviet Union. Romanian government is Soviet concern exclusively. No pretense of democratic process. No attempt at maintaining fiction. The mask was dropping because Stalin recognized American commitment to cooperation outweighed American commitment to principle. He'd tested boundaries and found them non-existent. The delegation dynamics revealed deeper problem. Truman's advisors surrounded him protectively, filtering Churchill's input, emphasizing cooperation, downplaying confrontation. When Churchill requested private meeting to discuss strategy, Burns engineered delay. When Eden proposed coordinated Anglo-American position, American delegation claimed they needed to maintain independence from British influence. The very partnership Roosevelt had cultivated was being systematically dismantled by advisors who viewed British experience as corrupting rather than illuminating. Soviet intelligence observed this division expertly. Stalin's tactics adapted immediately. He began approaching Truman directly, suggesting Churchill was obstacle to understanding, proposing bilateral Soviet-American agreements excluding Britain. The strategy was transparent. Divide partners, isolate Britain, negotiate separately with naive Americans, extract maximum concessions. Truman's team didn't recognize the manipulation because recognizing it would require admitting Churchill was right, and admitting Churchill was right would require acknowledging their entire approach was flawed. The atomic revelation produced unintended consequences. Instead of intimidating Stalin into moderation, it confirmed his determination to develop Soviet nuclear weapons urgently. Intelligence officers noticed immediate increase in Soviet questions about American nuclear program, aggressive recruitment of atomic scientists, demands for German nuclear research facilities. By trying to build trust through transparency, Burns had triggered arms race. Churchill had predicted this exact outcome. His prediction was dismissed as warmongering. Now reality was validating his warnings too late to prevent the consequences. Mid-conference assessment by British delegation was devastating. Americans were learning, but slowly, incrementally, painfully. Each Soviet rejection caused slight recalibration, but fundamental naivety remained intact. Truman still believed Stalin would become reasonable eventually. Burns still thought clever deal-making would solve disagreements. The systematic purge of Roosevelt's experienced advisors meant institutional memory was lost. Every lesson had to be relearned, every mistake repeated. "They've set themselves back 2 years," concluded Cadogan. "Everything Roosevelt's team understood, Truman's team must discover themselves, and millions will remain enslaved during their education." Churchill departed Potsdam exhausted and vindicated, but not satisfied. Vindication meant nothing without changed policy. Americans now believed Soviet cooperation was more difficult than assumed, but they hadn't grasped fundamental truth. Stalin's objectives were incompatible with democratic Europe. Compromise was impossible. Confrontation was inevitable. The only question was whether confrontation would occur from position of strength now or position of weakness later after Soviet control was irreversible. Truman's purge of experienced advisors had delayed American understanding precisely when speed was essential. The education was beginning, but graduates wouldn't emerge for years, and the tuition would be paid in Polish blood, Czech freedom, Hungarian suffering. 26th July 1945, 11:47 p.m. London. Election results were undeniable. Churchill's government had been rejected decisively by British voters who wanted change after 6 years of total war. Labour won 393 seats. Conservatives retained only 197. The man who had led Britain through her darkest hours would depart Downing Street, replaced by Attlee. Churchill's final evening as Prime Minister was spent drafting comprehensive briefing on Soviet threat for his successor. The document ran 47 pages, detailing every warning ignored, every prediction validated, every consequence of American diplomatic inexperience that would shape coming decades. His concluding paragraph reflected profound sadness. "We have won the war, but may lose the peace, not through weakness, but through innocence. America's innocence of European realities and our inability to educate them before learning became catastrophically expensive." The subsequent months validated Churchill's fears with relentless precision. Poland's promised free elections were postponed indefinitely. Soviet authorities claimed fascist elements required elimination first. By 1947, opposition parties were banned. Home army resistance was crushed. Show trials executed democratic leaders. Romania, Bulgaria, Hungary followed identical pattern. Initial coalition governments gradually purged non-communists. Elections were rigged systematically. NKVD-trained security services imprisoned thousands. Czechoslovakia maintained democracy longest, until February 1948, when communist coup destroyed the last functioning democracy in Eastern Europe. Exactly as Churchill had predicted, exactly as Truman's purged advisors would have recognized, exactly as new American officials hadn't believed possible. Truman himself underwent dramatic transformation, but gradually, painfully, expensively. The education Churchill couldn't provide in 1945 came through bitter experience, 1946 to 1949. Soviet rejection of Marshall Plan participation revealed Stalin's determination to isolate Eastern Europe completely. Communist insurgency in Greece demonstrated Soviet willingness to expand through proxy warfare. Berlin blockade, 1948-1949, exposed Soviet readiness to risk confrontation when testing Western resolve. Each crisis taught lesson British experience had offered freely years earlier. Truman's learning curve was measured in suffering. Polish Democrats arrested, Czech freedom destroyed, Greek villages burned, Berlin residents starving. The institutional consequences were profound. By 1947, Truman had rebuilt diplomatic establishment around officials who understood Soviet threat viscerally because they'd experienced Stalin's methods personally. Kennan's famous long telegram articulated containment strategy, essentially identical to Churchill's proposals from 1945, but now coming from American diplomat so finally credible in Washington. Marshall, Bradley, Acheson, the architects of Cold War policy, implemented approaches Churchill had advocated years earlier. The difference: implementing in 1947 meant confronting Soviet empire controlling 100 million Europeans, permanent Red Army divisions throughout Eastern Europe, communist parties entrenched in power. Implementing in 1945 would have meant preventing that empire's creation entirely. Churchill's political exile proved temporary. Conservative victory 1951 returned him to Downing Street, but Britain's relative power had declined precipitously. American economic dominance was absolute now. Marshall Plan distributed $13 billion, establishing American preeminence. NATO formalized American security guarantee, replacing British imperial system. Britain retained nuclear weapons, permanent UN Security Council seat, global military presence, but America indisputably led Western alliance. The special relationship Churchill cultivated was real but asymmetric, junior partnership, not equal collaboration. British experience was valued now, but American power decided policy. The human cost was what haunted Churchill's final years. Statistics enumerated suffering: 14 million displaced persons, 1 million political prisoners in Gulag system by 1953, 300,000 executed in post-war purges, entire nations imprisoned behind Iron Curtain. Each number represented lives destroyed, families separated, freedom crushed, suffering that might have been prevented had Truman's advisors understood in 1945 what they finally grasped by 1948. "We tried warning them," Churchill reflected in 1953 memoir. "They dismissed our warnings as imperialism. By time they believed us, prevention was impossible. Only containment remained, freezing empire in place, not liberating its victims." Would the documentation revealed decades later confirm Churchill's assessment completely? Soviet archives, open 1990s, showed Stalin's private discussions, April-May 1945. He recognized Roosevelt's death as strategic opportunity, understood Truman's inexperience, created window for expansion, deliberately tested boundaries, knowing new American leadership wouldn't recognize manipulation. His calculation proved devastatingly accurate. Veteran diplomats like Harriman would have identified Soviet tactics immediately, coordinated firm response with British, maintained leverage. Truman's new advisors instead provided exactly the weakness Stalin had anticipated: hesitation, division, delayed confrontation that allowed consolidation. The counterfactual tormented British policymakers. What if Roosevelt had lived? What if Hopkins, Harriman, Wynant had remained influential? What if Truman had trusted Churchill's warnings? Historians would debate these questions indefinitely, but participants knew the answer. 6 months, estimated Ismay in retirement interview 1965. "We needed American leadership that understood Soviet methods for 6 months, April through September 1945, while military situations still created leverage. Instead, we got 2 years of education. Those 2 years cost half of Europe its freedom for half a century." The personal toll on Churchill was substantial. The man who correctly predicted Hitler's threat, who rallied Britain through isolation, who helped forge Grand Alliance, who understood Stalin's nature earlier than his allies. This man was dismissed as alarmist precisely when his warnings were most urgent. Vindication came too late to prevent catastrophe. His famous Iron Curtain speech, March 1946, was initially criticized in America as warmongering, only later recognized as prescient analysis. The pattern repeated: Churchill right, Churchill ignored, Churchill eventually validated after damage was irreversible. Yet Churchill's legacy ultimately prevailed. Containment strategy he advocated prevented further Soviet expansion. NATO alliance he envisioned protected Western Europe successfully. Special relationship he cultivated sustained Anglo-American partnership through decades of Cold War. Democratic capitalism he defended prevailed over Soviet communism, though the victory required 45 years and came too late for those imprisoned 1945 and 1989. The education of American diplomacy that began so painfully in 1945 produced wisdom that eventually won the struggle, vindicating Churchill's warnings while lamenting the price of initially ignoring them. The final irony was profound. Truman's purge of Roosevelt's diplomatic inner circle, intended to assert independence and avoid British manipulation, produced exactly the catastrophe Churchill feared. Inexperienced advisers made predictable mistakes. Stalin exploited those mistakes ruthlessly. Millions suffered unnecessarily, and gradually, painfully, expensively, American policy evolved to embrace positions identical to those Churchill had advocated in April 1945. The detour cost a generation its freedom, vindicated British experience, and taught both nations that wisdom cannot be deliberately discarded without consequence. Institutional memory, diplomatic experience, and hard-learned understanding are precisely the assets most needed when confronting adversaries who value experience over innocence, ruthlessness over idealism, and power over promises. If this hidden chapter of Churchill's struggle moved you, help preserve these forgotten histories. Subscribe to our channel for deeper dives into the decisions that shaped our world, the rooms where fate was decided, the warnings that were ignored, the consequences that still echo today. Share this story with anyone who appreciates how individual choices ripple through decades. And tell us in the comments what other untold moments from the war's end deserve rediscovery. History isn't just about what happened, it's about understanding why, so we never make the same mistakes twice. Ring the bell, stay curious, remember wisely.